Good evening, everyone. I do that every time. Every time. I don't learn. I'm admitting a couple more people here and then we'll get started. This is our last Great Decisions program for 2021. And if anyone is interested, we still have 2 workbooks left at the checkout desk for sale. They'll be $5. So if you didn't get one and you'd like one, they're $5 and they're available at the checkout desk. Okay. Well, I'm going to get started with our introduction and our rules and all that stuff, even though I'm sure you guys all know it already. We have to go through it anyways. Maybe. There we go. So I just want to first and foremost thank our sponsors for our Great Decisions series, the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation, and Carol and Tom Donovan, and the family of Dora Sargent, in memory of Dora, who used to come to our Great Decisions programs religiously. So how this will work, we're going to watch the video and we ask that you stay muted during the video, which I see that you all are. We'll watch it together as a group. It's usually about half an hour or so in length. And then after the video, I will have some discussion questions to get us talking. And obviously, if you have a point you want to make or a question that you have, please also add that to the conversation. And while you're speaking, you do need to unmute so we can hear you. And then once you have finished, please mute yourself for those others in the group to respond. And we will have this program wrapped up by 8 o'clock. Our rules for the discussion, please be respectful of all viewpoints. Please stay on topic and don't hog the microphone. Please try and limit your comments to about 2 to 3 minutes. And with that, it looks like everyone's here. No one else has joined. So I'm going to get started with the video.
The United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with primacy in power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability to the future.
At the heart of U.S. foreign policy is a deep-seated ambivalence. Some American leaders, believing that global problems must have global solutions, have put their faith in institutions with worldwide mandates. Others have derided those same organizations as ineffectual and have asserted that America ought to stand alone. Great Decisions examines the perils and promises of multilateralism and asks whether global cooperation can endure in an era of nationalist retrenchment. The end of the global order? Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Herford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
Every 4 years, American voters head to the polls to elect a president. At issue is not just who will occupy the White House, but how actively the U.S. will engage with the rest of the world.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
America is back, ready to lead the world, not retreat from it.
In his 4 years in office, President Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of a host of multilateral institutions.
The Trump administration announced today that it will withdraw the U.S. from UNESCO, the United Nations body that protects global cultural heritage, in response to its designation of the old city of Hebron as a Palestinian World Heritage Site.
In a joint statement this afternoon, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley said the U.S. will no longer participate in the UN Human Rights Council.
Today, President Trump formally notified Congress of his intent to withdraw the U.S. from the World Health Organization, the international agency responsible for fighting disease.
One of the things that the United States is we're still the biggest player on the block. Now, we shouldn't yield to the second biggest or the third biggest or worse. We need to pick our alliances carefully, make sure that there are enough shared values that we can feel comfortable with that partnership.
The United States stepping back from that position of international leadership loses U.S. influence. If we leave the table, there are other countries who are quite happy to take our seat.
Three-quarters of a century has passed since the end of World War II ushered in a new system of multilateral commitments. Now, in an era of rising nationalism, the institutions that were built to bring the world together are being tested.
Now, I've been worrying about different aspects of the world for some time and have concluded that we are now on a hinge of history, sort of comparable to what the people at the end of World War II faced.
I think going forward, the real question is, what is the norm? Is the last 75 years the norm and Donald Trump the aberration? Or in some ways, was the last 75 years something of the exception and Donald Trump was a harbinger of a return to America's tradition of holding back from the world? I don't have the answer to that, but a lot of history will depend on that answer.
Today, the General Assembly will take up sub-item E of Agenda Item 105 of the election of 14 members of the Human Rights Council.
In 2006, the UN approved the formation of a body dedicated to the protection of human rights around the world. But George W. Bush kept the U.S. out of this new council.
The idea was that it had become so dominated by anti-human rights members that it was nowhere close to fulfilling its mission. It was clear that it would only be a matter of time before the new Human Rights Council would have the same defects as its predecessor. And that's exactly what happened.
There really isn't a whole lot of evidence in terms of impact of the Human Rights Council in terms of addressing grave human rights situations around the world. The tough cases, those are the ones that the Human Rights Council needs to be focused on, and those countries often ignore the Human Rights Council, even if they're a subject of its resolutions at all.
When President Barack Obama took office in 2009, the U.S. finally joined the UN Human Rights Council.
The logic behind the Obama administration being in the UN Council on Human Rights is to be at the table to try to make it better. It is very fraught, but if we aren't there, then our voice is not there, our values are not there, our purpose is not there.
This was not a naive, idealistic decision. This was based on a very pragmatic assessment of the costs and benefits of engagement versus non-engagement. The idea that the United States would cede leadership on human rights without even taking a shot at this new institution, I think that that was just untenable for the Obama administration.
After 8 contentious years, experts disagreed whether U.S. participation had paid dividends.
And I'm proud to say that today, the Obama administration's leadership at the Human Rights Council has delivered real results.
They were successful at the margins. They were able to make some resolutions less troublesome or less onerous or less hypocritical than they otherwise might have been. But again, you still don't see the Human Rights Council under the Obama administration truly focus on those countries that need to be criticized. You didn't see resolutions condemning Cuba. You didn't see resolutions condemning Russia. You didn't see resolutions condemning China.
The results of our engagement at the Human Rights Council far exceeded anyone's wildest dreams. We had 4 special sessions on Syria. We were very engaged in the creation of a commission of inquiry on North Korea. LGBT rights, we got onto the agenda, and that had been inconceivable just a short time earlier.
I think there's a real question, absent U.S. leadership on the Human Rights Council, whether the Human Rights Council ever would have set up a human rights special rapporteur for Iran to actually investigate and hold accountable the Iranian government for its human rights abuses domestically, at a time when the UN Security Council was blocked by the Russian veto.
In 2018, President Trump reversed course. Once again, the U.S. refused to take part.
When I arrived, and still today, its members included some of the worst human rights violators. The dictatorships of Cuba, China, and Venezuela all have seats on the council.
Another criticism that the Trump administration made of the Human Rights Council is that it is biased against Israel. And that is evidently true. If you take a look at the number of condemnatory resolutions passed by the Human Rights Council, nearly half of them are focused on Israel. To think that Israel is the source of half of the world's human rights problems is simply ridiculous. China has never been criticized or been the subject of a condemnatory resolution by the Human Rights Council.
I think taking human rights seriously is important. You don't have to do that through a council that's 2 principal targets are Israel and the United States. I'm not saying the U.S. has a perfect record on human rights, but we're a democracy. I mean, we're presumably capable of correcting these problems ourselves. We don't need a nanny in Geneva lecturing us.
The way the UN Human Rights Council is evolved is a travesty. And I can see why the Trump administration would say, we're not going to have anything more to do with this. The question is, does it help? Do you want to throw your toys out the pram and just not be there at all? I think the view of the British government is it's better to be inside fighting that case than to say we leave.
With the U.S. on the sidelines, China worked tirelessly to expand its influence within the UN Human Rights Council. Those efforts secured international support for controversial policies in Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
There was a recent episode where China was successful in building a coalition to support its narrative about its role in Hong Kong. And this is a perfect example of where if the United States had been present, we would have been able to work the halls and find more country support and really change the narrative about whether China actually does have the support of the majority of countries.
What we've seen in recent years is China increasingly using its vast economic leverage to try to bring countries to its side within the UN. It's not facing much competition. It's incumbent on liberal democratic nations that believe in human rights to mobilize coalitions of countries so that China can't just waltz into the United Nations, mobilize its coalition, and then go uncontested.
American policymakers who hope to challenge China's global ambitions must determine whether to work inside or outside of existing institutions.
The universal principle, I believe, is this. If America unilaterally withdraws from the UN and multilateral institutions, it simply creates a bigger slice for major non-democracies like China to exercise even greater influence in the future. Far better, the United States remains in and prosecutes in each of these agencies a general reform program to make them as effective and as efficient as possible.
Multilateral organizations are always going to have a hard time agreeing on certain principles because you have this diversity of cultures and values and forms of government. I mean, on the one hand, you have China, which has an emperor for life, and then you have the United States, which is laissez-faire. And when you have those extremes and then all the diversity in between, it's always going to be difficult, which is why multinationals are always frustrating to Americans.
We have dozens of countries around the world who are at least open to and prepared to work with us. China does not have that for the most part. So I don't look at these institutions as somehow biased against the United States, and even in those occasions where they might be. That to me is a challenge for foreign policy. How within them do we build coalitions? That's why God invented diplomats.
Let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance to establish a worldwide rule of reason, to create an enduring peace under the guidance of God.
Today, the allied world salutes these representatives of 50 nations. They have made a beginning, a brave beginning that can build a mighty structure for peace.
When World War II ended, the U.S. championed the formation of the global order we know today.
The United States was the architect of so many of these multinational organizations. You know, they came out of, in so many ways, a devastated world in 1945 and a belief by Americans that the way to avoid catastrophic wars in the future was to create international institutions that were basically channels for dialogue and problem solving.
That was a very different world, a very different United States. Balance of power, distribution of power was far different. These institutions now have 75 years of a track record, not always, shall we say, glorious.
Even as the U.S. government embraced multilateralism, a strong undercurrent of skepticism ran through American politics.
I just say the hell with the UN. What is it anyway? It's a damn debating society. What good does it do? Very little.
The US can afford to be much more self-sufficient and independent than just about any other nation in the world. America always kind of stood a little bit to a side on these things, and it was given the permission to do that because most Western nations thought, look, we don't mind if America does its own stuff now and again, as long as it's inside the multilateral institutions when we need it to be.
Well, I suggested on the floor of the Senate today that we stop all funds for the United Nations. Now, what that'll do to the United Nations, I don't know. I have a hunch it would cause them to fold up, which would make me very happy at this particular point.
Well, in the United States, like in Australia and other Western democracies, it becomes an item of political sport, particularly within the political right and the far right, to just go on a general campaign of UN bashing. Why do politicians do that? It's because this attack on globalism, this straw man argument, has become a part of the identity politics of the right and the far right.
Globalism exerted a religious pull over past leaders, causing them to ignore their own national interests.
Today, the world looks very different from the circumstances of 1945. It is not so easy for bureaucratic institutions to evolve rapidly to face new challenges.
It's going to be very hard to see those organizations change. It's not that people don't know how they should change. It's that the major powers that comprise these institutions have to be prepared to bring their publics along. There's no magic wand that can be waved by the citizenry on their own, or by the Secretary General, or by any particular country.
What is the point of pretending that the organization is still committed to its original principles? And if that tension means that the organizations don't work, as many parts of the UN system didn't work during the Cold War, that's unfortunate, but then that ought to lead people to say, what are the alternatives? Not just keep plowing along as if the problem didn't exist.
You have seen over the history of the UN a surprising degree of innovation in looking at new ways to solve problems as they confront them. Something like peacekeeping was not in the UN Charter. The UN invented it when they had to in the middle of the Suez Crisis in 1956. So there are all kinds of ways that the UN, working with partners, needs to look at solutions in innovative ways.
When organizations depend on consensus, a member state that refuses to live up to its commitments can spark frustration and recrimination.
In the early days of the WTO, we tried to operate fully by consensus. We're now at 164 members, and deciding every single thing by consensus has become unmanageable. So what members are doing, they are figuring out how to advance the most sensitive issues. Flexibility is the only way, I think, the WTO can continue to upgrade itself in a progressive and quick enough manner.
To the extent that international organizations deal with political issues, you're going to see further gridlock as the member states disagree. And you saw this during the Cold War when the United States and the Soviet Union were often at odds.
The staunchest defenders of the multilateral order insist that institutions are merely forums where member states can interact. It is up to those individual countries to learn to cooperate.
There is no other forum where this is going to disappear. Whatever forum, whatever setup you design, you're still going to have different opinions. It's not changing the name of the forum or the place of the forum or the countries that are inside the forum that it's going to change the outcome.
Richard Holbrooke used to say about the UN that blaming the UN for a crisis is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the New York Knicks play badly. When are we going to get the kinds of reforms of these organizations that we need to make them fit for purpose in the 21st century? When the governments that comprise UN bodies are willing to back those reforms.
Throughout American history, policymakers have feared that the empowering of international institutions might impinge on national sovereignty.
I do not recognize higher law than the Constitution in temporal terms. I'm leaving religion out of this. We are sovereign, and the Constitution provides no opportunity to delegate that sovereignty to some international body.
My own view is that there's a false dichotomy that's often created between sovereignty and cooperation. One of the best ways to advance the sovereign interests of any country, including the United States, is by working with allies, working with other partners where you share common interests. And that's really how these institutions were created and what they're for.
Today, politicians who worry about the loss of sovereignty have mounted fierce opposition to American participation in the International Criminal Court, a tribunal founded in 2002 to prosecute individuals for crimes against humanity.
I've said before, the happiest day of my entire government career was the day that I unsigned the Clinton administration's signature on the Rome Statute creating the ICC. I think it's a thoroughly illegitimate institution. We don't recognize any international authority to judge American citizens. We judge American citizens.
I received word this morning that the ICC Appeals Chamber authorized an investigation into the activities of the Taliban and U.S. and Afghan personnel there. This is a truly breathtaking action by an unaccountable political institution masquerading as a legal body.
Our nation and this administration will not allow American citizens who have served our country to be subjected to illegitimate investigations.
There are, I think, real and legitimate concerns about the International Criminal Court and about its jurisdiction and how it could be used to affect American diplomats, American servicemen. And the ICC was not designed for situations where a country had a robust legal system.
Those who champion global institutions face an urgent question: how to present an effective case for multilateralism to skeptical voters.
The key challenge for any national political leadership is on matters of global governance to explain to their domestic political constituencies our membership of these international institutions, primarily in terms of their ability to advance our domestic national interests. And then you argue, and by the way, it helps the world as well.
The challenge with a narrow form of nationalism, a kind of insularity of worldview that leads you to believe that you can close your borders and solve your problems, is that the facts are not going to respect that ideology or that way of governing. We're not going to set back the clock, right? You're not going to see the end of global air travel or the end of global commerce.
The good news is, compared to 1945, we've got democracies on every continent. We have nations that are moving more and more toward respect of democratic values. But we also have democracies that are stressed. The authoritarian nations in the world moved into a new chapter of trying to promote the idea that authoritarian governance models are the right ones for the 21st century. I think we have to rebut that critique, not just by trying to be a strong democracy in the United States, but by pulling democracies of the world together.
Those non-Americans who have observed the shifting attitudes of the U.S. government most closely are optimistic that multilateral organizations can function effectively even without U.S. participation.
I watched very carefully the World Health Assembly, which is the highest decision-making body of the WHO. The European Union was the one that was stepping forward and proposing, really sort of drafting all of the key decisions. That's a role that historically I think the United States often had, but with the US absent, it was Europe that was able to bridge the different gaps.
I call for like-minded countries in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas to triage the institutions of multilateral governance until we re-establish a level of geopolitical equilibrium between China and the United States. The ball, I think, well and truly lies in the court of an incoming Biden administration. I do think this is the last chance saloon for American global leadership.
It may be that we'll look back again at this and say the idea that you need a country to lead us out of a crisis is a very 20th century notion, and that leadership has become much more fragmented, diverse, as has power, and therefore we shouldn't be expecting America or any country to come up and lead.
Since 1945, the world has learned that multilateralism is messy, tedious, frustrating, and imperfect. Partnerships form and dissolve, and institutions come and go. But at a time when emerging threats can so easily cross borders, the nations of the world have little choice but to find some way to work together.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion.
Okay, so that was the little documentary on the end of globalization. So now we have a number of questions for discussion that I'll go through. If you have something to say, just please unmute and give your thoughts, and then mute back up and let the next person talk. So I'll get started with the first question. Can any country afford to ignore the growing trends of globalization in favor of isolationist policies? Any thoughts? I see that you all have so much to say. If any of you were with us last week, we talked about the role of the WHO, and I think this is very similar in the fact that it is a multilateral organization, or there are many multilateral organizations we were talking about, and there's really no clear answer. So is it possible for a country to just isolate itself and still function?
It's really a loaded question, you know, when you think about it. This, and it's not your doing, but to just say that I'm going to like completely ignore the rest of the world, well, that's not how things function anymore. So the answer is probably an obvious yes. No, that you can't afford to ignore it. I mean, you're dependent upon other countries for, you know, whether it be resources, you know, maybe in some cases labor, in some cases just the economics of your own, you know, trade with them. So just to say I'm going to close it down, it's just hard to really see that where you wouldn't have a need for at least some level of global interaction. Yeah.
I think the biggest example of a country that does not interact globally, however, would be North Korea. And we see how well they're doing, at least in my personal opinion. I don't think they have much interaction with any other country outside of possibly China and possibly Russia. But I don't know. Don't quote me on that.
No, and you would be right with that.
Well, I can move on to the next question, but I can't guarantee it'll be an easier answer.
This is Pilgrim. I'm just finishing my supper. I didn't think you wanted to watch me eat while with growing world population and growing ability to find out what's going on in so many different countries because of the internet, I don't think anybody can afford to ignore any of those things. We'll all go down with the ship, I think, if we do ignore it.
I think that's a good point. Okay, well, I will move on to the next one. How can globalization be improved so that it can benefit more and more of the global populace? And what has prevented this in the past?
I'll say, I think the institutions like the United Nations need rethinking and revising, and I know people are working on that, and that would be very helpful. So I'll say.
Agreed. I think it would be, and I think I never realized that the UN was kind of so dysfunctional until I watched this video earlier when I was getting ready for this, and it's very disappointing to me. I guess I should read up more on the UN and also what people are trying to do to make it better. If you have any, if you have read anything and would like to share, like, what are some ideas that people have to make it more functional? I would love to.
I was a part of a book group that is still meeting. I stopped. I only did it for a year, but it was, I can't even remember. It's about it's a UN, it's a book club on improving the United Nations. And there are people from all over the world in this thing, and they have great ideas for improving it. I don't have the author's name. Joseph, I can't remember his last name. He wrote a big book on how to improve the United Nations, and we went through it, and there are definitely areas, you know, that can be changed, but you've got to have the different countries in agreement to make the changes. I guess that's the hard thing. But there are definite possibilities in making it better. And it was kind of exciting seeing what some of these changes would be. When, oh, that would be a really good one.
Mm-hmm.
I think that maybe the one thing that comes to mind on the UN is I think 5 of the countries have veto power. And, it seems like China or Russia can, or sometimes France can pull the card. And I think that that's an issue. Maybe they should do away with that veto card for the 5 countries, because when it's one against a couple hundred, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, even though those are the rules to start with. Maybe that needs to be amended.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the UN, but why do those certain countries have veto power? And who chose those countries?
End of World War II. They
Okay.
were the basically the allies at the end of World War II.
But China has veto power, correct? But they weren't one of our allies at the end of World War II, were they?
But nevertheless, it was that group.
Okay. Well, then is
my
it
very limited understanding? I know that I have just a grain of sand type knowledge on the level. I wanted to address the author.
Oops.
Dr. Kruger, in the last page, sort of addresses this, and she considers the possibility that you would have regional trading blocks, and how would that work? And she sort of works through it, and I think I agree with her that it would probably move toward being the global trading arrangement that we have now, as messy as it is. And because she spent the first several pages discussing how much improvement we've had in the world because of the globalization. Perhaps it's not going to continue at that very high rate, because it's starting from a low position. But it's hard to see how any less global arrangement is as good. I don't have an answer for North Korea.
I don't. They didn't touch much on the World Trade Organization or the World Bank in this documentary that they did, and I kind of wish they would have, because I do know that people take issue with both of those organizations quite often. So I kind of wish they would have focused on that a little bit more.
I'll just chime in about what has prevented some of this effectiveness in the past. We watched the video early on here, and they showed that that map of whatever China had cobbled together to kind of support what it was doing in Hong Kong. And I think this is kind of indicative of what these kind of entities have historically been. You have members that are either weak-minded, and I guess I would put that group of countries as weak-minded, even support that kind of nonsense going on that China did, or you have countries that are weak-willed, and I've actually lumped in most of Europe with that. Who would actually stand up to a lot of these countries doing this kind of stuff? You have China running around doing whatever it does. Who's really standing up to them? We actually would make an attempt. I think we've regressed considerably in the last few months here. And so you look at this, and so how do these entities actually function? I mean, who is going to stand up? Who's going to take the lead? They really, and if they're going to have this quote governing authority, well, who's governing it? I mean, who are you taking directions from? Weak-minded or weak-willed? It's not a good mix either way. So to me, I look at these. They're wonderful for discussion. Maybe Nixon had it right, and maybe right. That they're just a debate forum. But in that regards, at least they're a forum for discussion. But to sit there and take direction from something that's just so clearly, just borderline insane, what is the point with some of these entities or these organizations?
Okay. Does anyone have a response to that or a different viewpoint?
I wanted to show you, this is the book. It's called Transforming the United Nations Designs for a Workable World by Joseph E. Schwartzberg. He just died about a year ago, but he was in on some of the conversations. And it's a very thorough book on changes for the UN.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And if anybody else is interested, the title and author are in the chat. You can grab it from there. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, well then I think I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay, what does the next stage of globalization look like? Would we see more power ceded to international organizations, or would we see less? And does globalization have a future 20 years from now? I personally don't think we could ever completely get rid of some of these institutions. So I don't think it's gonna not be around in 20 years, but maybe far less influence.
I think it does continue. I think, what do we see? You probably see it more consolidated in a way. Again, I go back to my comment about like China and some of these, we saw Africa a few weeks ago. We were watching things on that. Do you start seeing more of the partnering up, pairing up, that they've had so much influence there that, it's not as many countries anymore that it's really and again, I'm focusing on China here, that it's China and their other 20, quote, friends that are voting all the same, and that they just kind of act in unison in that. And so I wonder if globalization, yeah, it's global, but it's more of a couple of key, partnerships, and that's about it.
Possibly.
I think there'll be globalization, but I think technology is going to drive a Western group of countries versus the technology of, say, the Chinese and their partners. I see the technology, especially the internet and their protections or lack of protections. I think there's going to be two systems, and I think the countries on both, there'll be two systems, if you will, West versus the other set of countries. And I think it's going to be technology driven and who they trust.
Good point. Definitely technology is I think technology will be driving pretty much everything from here on out. It seems like it, at least. Does anyone else?
I can't help but think that the environment is going to drive our decisions. Really, it's kind of controlling us. And we're going to have to work together to save ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And that's something they didn't really touch on at all, is the environment. And some places are going to lack resources. I mean, there are plenty of places in the world already that lack clean, fresh water. And, they look to these larger countries with more power for help in getting those resources. So that's another thing that maybe that could have been touched on, is the environment is probably going to cause countries to create partnerships, kind of like with China and its partners, but, is the country going to go to whatever power can help them the most? I think that would be advantageous.
I was going to point to two things. China actually is pretty imaginative and taking some significant actions on the environment. Some of it is, their form of government is easier in many ways to take big, bold actions. It's like herding cats to get anything through our legislature. But I wanted to point to something else, and I'm involved in automobiles, and it was not too many years ago that we were adamant that we were staying with inch sizes for all of our fasteners, bolts, nuts, and consequently all the tools. And we dominated automotive engineering and production, and thus it worked. But most of the rest of the world merrily went to the metric system, and it was tried here, but it was always beaten back. Well, we've now, automobiles that are under American nameplates are now a polyglot. They're a mixture of fittings that are metric sized and fittings that are SAE or inch size. And but it's sort of just happened slowly. And in physics, there's an idea that big changes come slowly because people have to die, because they refuse to give up on the way they understood it when they were 40. So you have to get them out of the institution and let the young people come along, and the changes. So somewhere in that mixture of comments, there might have been something worthwhile.
Well, thank you. All right. Does anyone else have anything else on this question? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next one. Okay. What are the biggest drawbacks to globalization? And what are some ways governments can better combat those disadvantages of globalization? Good question. I don't know if I have an answer for it. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
The first thing I think of is greed and not listening to the other. If my country is doing well and I don't want to think about what's going on over there, it's going to cause problems. So I guess not listening, and not willing to let other people have something as well would be a problem. I mean, I'm looking at it from being in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of countries, though, that are also affected by greed that would be that way as well.
This is Pilgrim again. I think the biggest drawback is that somebody has to give up something. We've always done it that way. That's a remark I've been hearing ever since I can remember. And there may be a better way to do it, or more people do it this way, and we would fit in better if we would continue to follow your path that you're doing.
I think it's the trick is when we're trying to lift people up or get people to a better stand, or if that's a goal of globalization, well, what is that standard? I mean, in whose mind or whose perception is that? It's really hard to just say, we're all going to have people have the same standard across the world. That's just not how things work. I mean, there are different environments, there are different cultures, different opportunities. So to just have everybody on the same playing field, it's just pie in the sky. So it's finding a balance there, and trying to figure out where is that. So drawbacks, that's hard, because it's like you're trying to get so many different views. But on the contrary, if you just get one view, is that the right view either? So I think it's really hard. You sometimes get the paralysis by analysis with trying to figure out how do we take care of everybody all at once.
I don't think it's possible to take care of everybody. And you bring up a really good point about having one standard for everyone. Everyone lives differently, and no one country should or one group should impose their beliefs and thought systems and how they think you should live on another person. So that, I think, is probably correct in that. That's a huge drawback. There's no reason that I don't think, yeah, it's like, how would we feel if China told us that we had to adopt communism? You know, whereas who has the right to say how one person should live? I don't know. That doesn't make so much sense, but I agree with you, I guess.
Yeah, no, it does. And I mean, and the reality is, I mean, the world has been a different place for its entire existence. So, you know, that is just part of the uniqueness of the human experience to have some of that. So, you know, yeah, we can have things maybe done for the good of humanity, a common good. You know, again, it's, you know, how do we define that? But, you know, you can never just say, I think it's hard to just have everybody adopt the view that, oh, well, we have to do it for the good of everyone. This is always the way we're going to do it. You know, people have their own interests too, and people always will.
I agree.
I have another point. If this is a long time ago, I read where the airlines and the air traffic controllers worldwide use English because the planes started traveling further and further, and it became more difficult. So they decided they could work with one language. So we're already doing that something along these lines, but the drawback was that all the other countries had to give up using the pilots using their language. I believe that's the way it's still done. Does anybody know for sure?
I'm a retired airline captain. If you're in Germany and it's a German airplane and a German controller, they will speak German sometimes, but they had flawless English when I would come on. And the only disadvantage to having both languages in, the German pilots typically all spoke English, and so they could follow the conversation when the controller and I were talking. But I and my co-pilot and flight engineer, we could not follow the German conversation. That's a minor drawback. But the rules that you pointed to are that if the English is the standard, unless both the controller and the cockpit have the same language, and then if they wish, they can converse in their native language. That's much more common in some countries than it is in others, but even that's dropping away. They even use English in places where they're all local pilots, but it's just easier. And some of the terminology is easier to pronounce in English than it is in German.
Cool. Thank you for that. I didn't know that. Interesting. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add on this question?
It is, you know what, I was just thinking, I was reading this morning and thinking about, from the book, it was on page 94, it was 75% of an English laborer's wage was spent on food and drink, and 10% on clothing, 6% on housing, 5% on heating, and 4% on light and soap. And there was nothing left after that. You know, what a different world. Wow.
Yeah, I don't think it gives a breakdown of what we spent our money on now. I don't know if I'd want to know.
I'm surprised that somebody hasn't talked about in this area how many industries have left and former people that worked there and had, in some cases, multiple generations, 2 and 3 generations. And the only image they had for their work life was that they were going to work at and retire from, and you fill in the blank of which one of the local corporations. And now that's all gone. And so that's a challenge in my judgment of how do we design a program to help the people. We usually couch it in form of retraining, but often those people are really, really reluctant to retrain because they have a self-image of, I'm a punch press operator, or I work in the foundry, or they have wonderful skills, but they keep hoping that that'll come back. And Kenosha is actually a pretty good, they finally gave up on getting that back and have developed other things, and they've had more success at that. But that's, in my mind, that's the challenge from this question. And we've had a fair amount of experimentation locally about trying to do that. You can tell some folks that are very low skilled and low basic education, but they still deserve to, have a reasonable life and a warm place to sleep, and kids taken care of. And they really struggle to try to, and then frankly, we have prejudices that those people have more difficulty getting a job.
Yeah, you do bring up a good point in that with globalization, our manufacturing, our, I guess, what would they call it, unskilled labor? I'm not sure, because to me that seems like you need to have some skill to run a machine. That did, like, there was a mass exodus of it, right? And so that is a huge drawback, and there isn't, you can't make a good living working at a grocery store or a restaurant, fast food restaurant, it's hard. So what do we do about that? I mean,
we haven't done much in the way of retraining compared to, I guess, some countries that really do that for their citizens. We haven't done that much here.
No, I would agree with that.
I wonder whatever happened to all the people that used to make harnesses and other things for horses.
Well, people still ride horses though, right? Sure, there were, but there weren't as many people back then, right? Too.
Well, they turned into auto mechanics, or the next generation turned into auto mechanics. And
does anybody have anything else?
Yeah, just one point, and it's kind of a strange situation. The world has gotten more effort to try to help everybody get healthier. So our populations have begun to grow larger and larger all around the world. And manufacturing has gotten more efficient, more effective. And what's happening is jobs are being shifted to countries where you can get cheap labor, but the problem becomes, like, companies that leave the United States, there's no jobs for these people. You can retrain people, but with companies becoming, and manufacturing and all companies becoming more effective and efficient, and populations growing and people getting more health care, you're developing a big, vast group of people that there's no function for. And I'm not saying you kill people off, but there's a problem here. We're growing populations above and beyond what the world can sustain as far as providing functional jobs. They're not out there. You can see it, that there's people willing to come up here from Mexico because they got nothing to do. We're shipping jobs out of the country. We've got people living in the streets, and manufacturing is getting more efficient, more effective. becoming more profitable, but there's more and more people without work. And the more people you keep getting healthy and the bigger the populations get, we're facing a major, major problem in the world somewhere down the line. I'm not going to be around to see it, but 25, 30 years from now, there's going to be significant problems unless somebody goes to war and wipes out a big portion of the population, or another controlled pandemic occurs. That's my point.
Okay, does anybody else have anything to say?
Yeah, I do. I'm dreaming of what to me would be a possible ideal situation, but I know it wouldn't be, but I would kind of imagine it might. And that is, if we had a base wage for everyone, base, very base, just so that people are not starving or in the cold, and then people might want to work at the things that are meaningful to them, because there are so many things that we need that aren't getting done. And people could take on jobs that are new ideas, new things, and helping each other more. Not just making things, but actually helping each other.
Okay. Anybody else have any other thoughts or ideas or questions? I'm not sure if this is the last question or not. Let's see.
Just the last.
Whoops, that wasn't, that was an accident.
I say something positive then, because we're a little bit grim here at the end. The United States has dealt with these kinds of issues, and we've had concerns, but we have repeatedly. And I'm going to say that I think we're getting more and more. We're more aware of what you might, people who in 50 years ago would have been considered the other, and they were not considered, a real part of real America. And we got certainly there's lots of room to grow in that, but we're making some progress on that, and we seem to struggle. Again, it's the herding cats sort of a thing. It's sort of hard to watch sometimes, but that's one of the characteristics of Americans, is we are very flexible and imaginative, and I think we're getting more inclusive. So I'm very optimistic. So there.
Good. I'm glad you're optimistic. I did have another question, so I hope we're not going to go back down the rabbit hole of not being optimistic, because I like that ending on that. But I'm just going to quick ask it. If you have thoughts, great. Otherwise, we can finish up with your final thoughts. But the last question that I did have is, which nation, in your opinion, is the leader of the globalization movement? I think it might be possible that we kind of touched on that already. And why is it? And can they find a way to make it more appealing to the global masses? I think we kind of talked a little bit about that. I think kind of almost seems like China might be the leader, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think if you define globalization by trading, certainly it is China. I mean, I believe they're the biggest exporter.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly are the biggest importer. I think there's much question about that. And we're trying to change that relationship, but I think they're right now undisputably the leader. So what can they do to make it more appealing? It's tough to compete with them when they have the government help their industry so much more than we do. So it's going to be a tough game. And they can make their decisions because they're authoritarian regime. They can make their decisions faster than we can. They're more efficient because they control from the top what happens for now.
Mhm.
At some point, it'll probably change and people will revolt. But for now, that's the way it is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also too, though, what is awful is that they do control their industries, and the people working in China work in awful conditions and for a very long time every day. And it's sad. But yeah, how can that change if the people don't revolt? They haven't yet.
Yeah, I agree that it's probably, quote, China is the leader in this. But if that's the case, that they're the leader, exactly what is admirable about this being a globalization movement? I mean, what is there to admire about that, the way they conduct themselves on many fronts? So to me, globalization is supposed to be done on the common good. This is not being done on the common good, what they're doing. So, to make it more appealing, they're not going to make it more appealing. It's going to be forced. It is not going to be that they're going to be providing a wonderful way of doing things, a concern for humanity. No, they'll push it, and we saw it in Africa. We saw it, a couple weeks ago when we were looking at. That's what's going on. So to me, they're not. Fine. If they're the leader, count me out.
I think it depends on what aspect you're looking at. I mean, when I think of an ideal place in the world, I think of New Zealand, and they certainly had control of the pandemic. Of course, it's an island, but they seem to have really good leadership there. So I'm looking at the countries that seem to be happy, and maybe those are the leaders in globalization. It depends what you're looking at. Are you looking at money? Are you looking at trade? What aspect are you looking at?
It is. It's clearly it's a wonderful place. They've never made an attempt to be a global player, and that's and good for them in a way. Maybe they've recognized their limitations. Wonderful place to visit. But we reached our limits there.
Does anybody else have any more thoughts on this?
Yeah, it seems to me that since we've had a political change in this country, that there are a lot more countries looking for us to take over again when we gave it up a while back. And from what I don't follow it very, very close. I find it a lot hard to understand. But his main message, I think, is that we got to do it all together. We have to work together. If we don't keep this ship from sinking, we're all going to go down with it.
Good point.
Yeah, I'm wondering about even the idea of leader. I mean, we're used to the idea of a leader, but why not look at what all the countries have? What are their strengths? And then we all learn from one another. So we're all in a way leading each other. Maybe there's one main country, but we're all part of that, leading each other.
Okay. Does anybody else have any final thoughts they'd like to share? If not, I'm going to thank you guys so much for joining me tonight and for joining us for Great Decisions this year. Fingers crossed that we will all be together in person next year for Great Decisions. It is much better that way. Although I'm very glad that we could do this virtually this year as well. So I want to thank everybody for coming. And I hope you guys all have a really great night.
Yeah, thanks a lot for doing this year. And thank you, gang, for sticking around.
Thank you. Yeah. That's
Yes,
good.
thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. This has been very enjoyable. And I've enjoyed the other people's comments as well.
Yeah, you guys have been great.
Everyone stay healthy.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.